Good morning, Title I coordinators, and thank you for joining us for our September webinar. I will get our presentation pulled up here. All right, so as always, I'm Erin Suddeth, and I'm the branch manager of the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch. I think everyone's already taken care of this, but in case we missed you, please make sure, those of you joining us in Teams, that you've got your cameras turned off and your microphones muted so that everybody can focus on our presentation. And we will have time for questions at the end. So at that point, if you want to raise your hand and come off mute or put something in the chat, feel free to do that. You can also just email those to me at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And we are recording this, and it'll be posted to our webpage probably later today or maybe tomorrow. If you weren't able to check out August's webinar, just a quick recap of what we talked about. We had our usual announcements and reminders and things like that. We also had PCG join us for the Title I Next overview and information about that opt-in period. We shared information about the carryover limitation for your school year 23-24 funds. We talked about the importance of displaying that OIG fraud hotline poster at the district and at all of your Title I schools. We reviewed some paraprofessional qualification information, and then I shared some upcoming professional learning opportunities. So you can find that recording on our webpage if you weren't able to join. Today, we're going to have our usual announcements and reminders, and then we're going to focus on the school year 24-25 comparability report. Specifically, we're going to talk about calculating comparability, go over some reminders and some of the common issues that we see when those reports are submitted. I'll share some troubleshooting information. We'll go over the documentation that you want to save in addition to that approved report, and then some examples of documentation as well as a new resource from KDE. So for our announcements and reminders, first of all, I want to thank everyone who attended our statewide federal programs training. We had a really good turnout and heard a lot of good information from the Brewman Group. Districts who are going to be carrying over more than 15% of Project 310K funds need to submit a carryover waiver request to KDE by September 30th. So that's going to be Monday. Be sure that you do that. And I do want to share, you did receive this in an email from me, or you should have if you didn't let me know. Our waiver request that we sent to the U.S. Department of Education was approved. And that waiver request did a couple of things for Title I Part A. First, it waived the requirement that limits KDE's ability to grant a waiver of the 15% carryover limitation once every 3 years. And it also extended the period of availability for school year 22-23 funds, that's Project 310J. It extended some other programs as well, and those are now extended to June 30th, 2025. They were set to expire on September 30th, and you now have until June 30th for that. And if you want to see that full approval announcement, it is in the September 16th Commissioner's Monday message. I do want to make a little point of clarification about the carryover waiver. And I think someone's joined who needs to mute their microphone. Thanks. So this waiver that we received from USAID allows us to grant districts a carryover waiver, even if that district has already gotten a carryover waiver in the last 3 years. Typically, you're only allowed to do it once every 3 years. It does not waive the requirement for the district to actually submit that waiver request to KDE and get approval for that. So just make sure that if you're going to be carrying over more than 15% of your total 310K allocation, that's your regular funds, parent and family engagement, private school, the whole thing, you need to submit that carryover waiver request. I have updated our timeline of obligations slide to focus on our new project, which is 310L. And remember, this is just to kind of help make sure that you are on track to obligate at least 85% of funds by September 30th, 2025. So these aren't ESSA required percentages. This is just an average divided out over the 15-month period. It's about 5.5% every month. So by the end of September, roughly 17% should be obligated, meaning spent or encumbered. If you're significantly below that point, just make sure you're checking in with your finance officer and making sure that you're going to be on track to meet those carryover requirements. And remember that once your consolidated application does receive full approval from KDE and you're able to draw down on those funds, you can use Project 310L funds to pay for allowable and approved expenditures going back to when that grant first started, which is July 1st of 2024. Now, if you have already obligated more than that, that's okay. You just want to keep an eye on it. If it's significantly less, you might consider increasing just how you monitor expenditures. Maybe that's those conversations with the finance officer, maybe meeting with the principals to talk about their spend down of funds, etc. And we have our open project quick reference table. We really only have one deadline to keep on your radar that's coming up, and that is, as I already said, that September 30th deadline to have 85% of funds obligated or that carryover waiver request submitted. And at some point, once I receive the next district balances spreadsheet, I'll be reaching out to districts who have not drawn down at least 85% just to verify that you didn't need a waiver and that you have those funds obligated. And I did update the information for Project 310K based on that approved waiver that I just mentioned. I used some strike-through text just to keep those original dates on there as a reminder. And we've got a TBD for the final federal cash request submission date. The updated award notifications will be posted by the 30th, and those will have that final FCR submission date on them. So I'll update this table for the future webinars. I think in past years when we've gotten these extensions, it's been maybe August 30th, but we'll know for sure once that is out. And also don't forget to check any of your open applications in GMAP just to make sure that there aren't any outstanding revisions that were requested by KDE. Let's see. Last time I checked, there are about between 30 and 50 applications for both FY23 and FY24 that are not currently listed as KDE Consolidated Consultant approved. Now, some of those may be for programs other than Title I Part A. Just be sure to go in and double check and make sure that you've taken care of everything that you need to. Our September Title I newsletter is available on our webpage. If you're not currently subscribed to that, just let me know and we'll get you added. We had a lot of great information in there. Of course, information about the carryover waiver reminder and a lot of information about the comparability report, which of course we'll be talking about today as well. We had a deep dive into comparability. So there was information about student enrollment reports, staff counts, common errors, and what to do if the workbook shows that you have any schools that are not comparable. Our principal's perspective article was focused on parent and family engagement events, specifically moving from entertainment to engagement. This is a really important issue, something that comes up a lot during monitoring. When we're supporting a parent event with Title I funds, we need to make sure that that event supports parents and gets them engaged in their child's education. It's not just a social event or a party or something like that. So be sure that you pass that along to your principals, or if you want to send me the email addresses of principals, I can add them to the subscriber list. We've been trying to include a principal article in every month's issue, so that would be a really great resource for them. We've also got some reminders about reviewing that GMAP feedback if your application is returned as not approved, and then our recurring articles about all of the monthly tasks and the open projects and things like that. All right, so moving on to the main topic today, which is comparability. It's always good to go over this every year because it is something that we just do once a year, so it's really easy to forget the exact steps and the ins and outs. So comparability is a requirement in ESSA. It's in section 1118C. And this requirement is just that districts have to demonstrate that the services that are provided in Title I schools are comparable to those provided in non-Title I schools before any Title I funds are spent. So this is focusing on services funded through state and local funds. And if all of the schools in a grade span are being served with Title I, then instead of comparing Title I to non-Title I, we compare the high poverty Title I schools to the lower poverty Title I schools and look for comparability there. So Kentucky districts complete this comparability report workbook every October and upload it into the GMAP district document library. And then your consultant will go in there and review and approve that. The comparability report is due on November 1st this year. It's always due on or around November 1st. Comparability can be calculated one of two ways. The majority of districts opt to use the student to staff ratio method first and save the salary comparison option for the event that comparability can't be demonstrated through those student to staff ratios. So for this webinar, we're going to focus on the student to staff ratios. There are some exclusions, districts who don't have to calculate comparability. I do want to be clear that all of the districts have to submit the comparability report in GMAP. If the district is not required to calculate comparability, you're only going to complete the first page of the Excel workbook. So the districts that won't be calculating comparability are our districts with only one school period or only one school per grade span, because there's nothing to compare those to. Now, if a district has a particular grade span where there are no schools served with Title I funds, then you're not going to calculate comparability for that grade span. For example, a lot of our districts don't serve any of their high schools, so they don't have to calculate comparability for the high schools. And we have several resources to support you in the completion of the comparability report. And we'll talk about where to download the report Excel workbook on the next slide. But the other available resources are all on our Documents and Resources webpage. And that includes the checklist. That just allows you to see what your KDE consultant uses when they review and hopefully approve your comparability report. We also have a comparability report guide. It's very detailed. It's got a lot of screenshots showing you exactly what to do on the report, and then a training video which walks you through the completion of the report. The video is about 25 minutes long, and I did make it a few years ago, so the years I reference might be a little bit old, but all of the information is the same. It may be beneficial to have your comparability report workbook open on one screen and the video or the guide open on another screen, just so you can toggle back and forth between those as you're completing it. So here are our comparability report reminders. The template that you need to use for the report is available in the GMAP district document library. You will click on Edit Documents, and then there's going to be a link where you can download that template. And this is the same place where you're going to upload the completed report as well. And I have some screenshots on the next slide just to kind of give you a better idea of where these things are. We do ask that you try to use our standard naming convention for the report, and that is the school year, then the district's name, and the abbreviation CompRep. So for example, 2024-25, Jefferson County CompRep. This just makes it easier for your consultants to keep track of, because all of our consultants work with more than one district. Some are working with more than 20 districts, so it can get a little bit confusing if they've all got different naming conventions. Be sure that you are using the template for the current school year. We do update the workbook every year so that all of the dates in it are correct, so make sure you are using the right one. And there is a tab of the workbook for the checklist. You don't need to complete this. This is just for KDE consultants to use as they're reviewing and approving your report. There is that PDF copy of the checklist on the Title I webpage that I just mentioned, and you can use that as a reference, and then you'll just leave the tab within the workbook blank. So these are just some screenshots from the GMAP district document library. So when you get to the document library, you'll pick 2025 for from the root folders menu, and then click search folders. And under all of the folders, you'll see an option for Title I comparability reports. Go ahead and expand that. And that's where you'll see that edit documents link. That will take you to the update documents and links page, and you'll see the link there to download the report template. These are some of our common comparability issues that we see when we have to return a comparability report, or when districts are having issues completing it, or maybe when we're monitoring and we end up having some findings for comparability. I've also got page references on this slide for the guide, and the guide is linked on the slide as well. So the very first issue is you want to make sure that when you open the file, you go ahead and click Enable Macros to make sure that the file works properly. There's all kinds of functions and equations sort of built in behind the scenes of this document, and if you don't enable the macros, then they're not going to work properly. The next issue that we see is starting on the report too early. So the window for completing comparability is between the last day of the second month of school and October 31st of the current school year, and a school month is defined as 20 teaching days. So for most of our districts, this is going to mean that that window is September 30th through October 31st. So you need to wait until Monday at the earliest to start pulling this information and completing your report. You also want to make sure that you've got all of your schools grouped correctly by both grade level and size. If a district doesn't have schools with overlapping grade spans, then grouping by grade is very straightforward. K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12, for example. Now, when there is overlap, you need to look at which groups share the most grade levels in common. For example, if we have a district that has some K through 5 schools and some 6 through 8 schools, and then one K through 6 school, we're going to group that K through 6 school with the K through 5 schools because it has more grades in common with that group. We're not going to make its own group. Schools are also grouped by enrollment size, and this is using the Infinite Campus Enrollment Summary Report. That's where you get the enrollment numbers that you report. And the two size groupings are kind of vague. They're just called large and small. And there is no set number that constitutes small versus large. The general rule of thumb is if the largest school has 2 times the enrollment of the smallest school, then that's how we're going to differentiate those. Now, for schools that fall in between the largest and the smallest, the district is just going to place those in the size grouping that they deem most appropriate, just at their discretion. It's important to make sure that you are being consistent in this across all of the grade spans. I also want to point out that your groupings may be different than the previous year based on changes in enrollment. So don't just automatically copy what you did last year and assume that it's all going to be okay. There might be some changes that need to be made. Some districts like to just sort of set a cutoff point for a grade span. Everything below 500 is this, above 500 is this. That's really up to you. You also want to make sure that you are including the correct staff. So on the comparability report, you report the full-time equivalency, or the FTE, which is the portion of a person's salary. You're reporting the FTE for staff who are paid with state and local funds. And these are instructional staff members, as well as those who assist or supervise instructional staff members. Now, if you have any itinerant staff, for example, a person who works 50% of the time at one school and 50% of the time at another school, you're going to prorate those and determine the FTE for each school and report that accordingly. Now, you don't include non-instructional staff, so any clerical staff, cafeteria workers, your janitorial staff, etc., they are not included on the comparability report. You also aren't going to include FTEs for instructional staff paid with any federal funds. So we're not just excluding Title I Part A salaries, Title I, Title II, 3, 4, IDEA, all of those funds should be excluded. Now, if you look in the guide on page 9, you'll also see a list of staff which may be excluded. Whether you opt to include these or exclude these staff, you just want to make sure that you are being consistent across all of your schools. Up next is making sure that you have the poverty rankings correctly. So I mentioned earlier that when all of the schools are served by Title I, we compare high poverty to low poverty. And in this scenario, we recommend referring to the poverty ranking of the schools within the GMAP application. That's the page that your consultant will check to verify that schools have been grouped by poverty accordingly. There's not any higher poverty schools that are listed down with the lower poverty schools. There are instances in which the poverty rankings have changed because, of course, your GMAP application has information from the previous school year and your comparability report has information from this school year. So you may have had some shifts. In that case, you might just want to give your consultant a heads up and say, here's why I put this here. They did change. And this is a new issue that I first saw last year. So avoid copying and pasting from files other than Excel. For example, I know a lot of our districts use Google Slides, not Google Slides, Google Sheets. So this can sometimes impact the functionality of the workbook. Sometimes it kind of like overwrites those behind the scenes formulas that we can't see. So last year we had a district with this issue and the report was saying that the schools weren't comparable, but they actually were. And I don't know how many hours the district spent before they reached out to me. If they're on here and they want to put that in the chat, they can. But I know that together we spent a solid hour trying to figure out what was going on with this report. And I finally just opened a completely brand new file and manually entered all of the data. And all of a sudden the schools were comparable. So that was a very stressful circumstance for that district. We don't want you to have to go through that. So just even if you think, hey, I've copied and pasted in the past, I'm pretty sure it worked, I'm going to recommend just manually entering all of that data just to be safe. All right, what do you do if you've completed the report and it says that you have any schools that are not comparable? Okay, first thing you're going to want to do is just double check all of your numbers. Make sure that you have counted the correct students and staff. For example, preschool students and staff are not included in the enrollment counts. This has come up a couple times during monitoring as well. Those should be excluded. You could also try using numbers from another date within that window. Remember, you have pretty much an entire month to choose from. It's not unusual for people to have to check multiple dates to find one that works for all of the schools for comparability. So if you start working on your report next week, but you can't find a date that works, don't panic. You have the rest of October to find something that works. I would probably go in and just kind of check every couple of days, maybe every day if I had the time, and just find one that works. Of course, you could also calculate comparability using the school-to-school salary comparison ratio rather than that student-to-staff ratio. That's something that we've not had to do very much in the past, so you may want to reach out to your consultant and we'll kind of walk you through that. But it's not that hard. I think it's a little bit intimidating, but the districts who've had to do it have said it wasn't that bad. And of course, you can always contact your KDE consultant for assistance. What you don't want to do, don't put the school in a different grade level or an inaccurate grade level or size group. You have to adhere to those grouping requirements that are outlined in the guide that I went over a minute ago. So schools with the same grade spans have to be grouped together. Schools with those overlapping grade spans need to be placed in the group where they have the most grades in common. And we don't want to see those large and small schools mixed together. Also, don't change which staff have been excluded at various schools. So I mentioned how there is that list of staff who may be excluded at the district's discretion. A couple of examples from that list are your EL teacher or staff who are paid for excess costs of providing services to children with disabilities. So if you've counted those at one school, you need to count them for all the schools, or if you've excluded them at one school, you need to exclude them from all the schools. We talk frequently about program documentation and what to save to demonstrate that you're meeting program requirements. Uniform grant guidance requires districts retain records for 3 years, and that's 2 CFR 200.334. Now, you may remember from our statewide federal programs training that the attorneys from the Brewman Group strongly recommend saving records for 5 years, and KDE recommends that as well as a best practice. In the event that your district is selected for monitoring, you will be required to provide KDE with the following documentation to support the information that was submitted in your comparability report. So up first is the Infinite Campus Enrollment Summary Reports for all of your schools. And a couple of notes about these reports. We do need the ones from Infinite Campus. Sometimes we've had some different reports submitted, but we need these exact ones from Infinite Campus. The date on the reports needs to match the date that you've listed in the report as the date that you determined comparability. So if you do this on Monday, then those reports should say September 30th. The school enrollment numbers on the reports need to match the numbers on the comparability report. So again, making sure, for example, that the preschool students have been excluded. We do recommend that once you've run the reports and you find something that works and you're ready to submit your comparability report, go ahead and save a copy of those exact reports for your records so that you have the exact documents with the same data that matches. What happens sometimes is that maybe you do the report in the morning and then later in the day we've got some students who enroll, some students who leave, and then if you have to pull these reports at a later date, all of a sudden those numbers don't quite match up. So just go ahead and save them when you do it. You're also going to need to provide staffing lists for the schools so that we can verify those FTE numbers that you reported. These lists need to clearly document the FTE of state and locally funded instructional staff at each school. Now, if you are selected for monitoring and you have to provide us with this, we want to make sure that KDE staff are able to easily locate the staffing data, which aligns with the data on the comparability report. And I'll have more on that in just a minute. It's also very important that you remove any personally identifiable information. So our next slides have 2 examples of staffing documentation, and we've seen a variety of methods for documenting staff FTE for comparability when we monitor, and these are just a couple of the ones we've seen that are very easy to read and understand. All right, here's our first example. So each district's human resources office has their own method for documenting staffing, and sometimes it can be very difficult for those of us who are not in the HR world to understand all of them. Another potential issue with just kind of sending us that big spreadsheet that HR has, we've sometimes had an issue where that document contains some personally identifiable information, such as full names of staff combined with employee numbers, addresses, phone numbers, even social security numbers. And that's not information that you need to be uploading to SharePoint or sending over email or anything. So a summary similar to the table on the screen is really easy to read, and it doesn't contain PII. So we could see that each position that is being counted has been listed there. That also allows KDE to ensure that only the instructional staff were counted. We don't have clerical staff or a cafeteria worker or somebody on there. We can also clearly identify the FTE of state and locally funded staff. So you don't have to use something like this, but it is an option. Now remember that only state and locally funded instructional staff FTEs are documented on the comparability report. So you might be wondering, why is there even a federally funded FTE column on this? As I mentioned on the previous slide, these are just some examples that we've seen districts use during monitoring, and they happen to include that column in their district. If it were me doing this, I think I might include that just so I kind of have the whole picture in one place. You could also easily remove this column. You may consider developing a process in your district that includes working with your HR office to kind of take the data from their master spreadsheet and summarizing it using something like this. A written process for comparability isn't required, but that would help ensure consistency. It would also enable others to complete the comparability report in the event of staffing changes. And this process could also be submitted to KDE during monitoring and maybe highlighted as a strength or a best practice for that district. So my second example has just a slightly different format. So you can see on this one that we've got the last name and the first initial for each documented staff member, but there's no accompanying information, no employee numbers or addresses or anything like that. So we're not worried about PII here. We've also got each person's position listed, again, making it easy to ensure that we're only including those instructional staff members. We've got our state and locally funded FTE column, our federally funded FTE column, and an additional column for other non-federal grant funded FTE. Just like that federally funded FTE column, this is completely optional, just something that this district decided to do. And with that, we do have a new resource available for districts. The name is a bit of a mouthful. This is the Comparability Report Instructional FTE Documentation Resource. It is located in the Sample Documents folder on the Title I Part A Documents and Resources webpage. You're going to be seeing some updated resources coming soon, and this is just one of the new ones. So this resource contains some basic information about comparability and the templates for the two example methods of documentation that were shared today. You're not required to use these templates. It's just something that if you want to, it's available for you. And so really quickly, let me just show you what that looks like. So yeah, just some basic summarization of comparability up here. Some completed examples, looks very similar to what I just went over. And then these blank templates that you can copy and just use for your documentation. All right, so that wraps up the webinar for today. But before we log off, do we have any questions about comparability? So if you're on Teams, if you want to raise your hand or put that in the chat, you can do that. You can also send those to me via email. And of course, after the webinar, you can send things to your assigned Title I consultant. Let me just check email here. All right, I don't see anything yet. All right, be sure to mark your calendar for our future webinars. It's hard to believe we've only got 3 left for 2024. So our next webinar is going to be a spooky webinar on Halloween at 10 a.m. as always. And I do always like to remind you that we value your feedback and want to learn more about what's helpful and what you want to see in these webinars. So you can always send suggestions directly to me or to your consultant. They can pass those on to me. But if you'd prefer to submit something anonymously, you can do that through our webinar feedback survey. And there's a link on the slide. It's always included in our monthly newsletter as well. So check the chat one last time. All right, I don't see anything. So if you think of something after the fact, just feel free to reach out and we will get you an answer. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you in October.